Part 2 of Deconstructing Common Life, starting with Section 3. Although true philosophy may criticize the world of common life, the principle of the autonomy of custom demands that common life be respected. Yet, at the same time, it should be stressed again that those who do not question common life at all, who follow the motions robotically, are also alienated and prone to totalitarianism like bad philosophers. A society with overly strong givens causes existential anxiety like a society without givens at all. As discussed in Belonging Again, both are circumstances in which totalitarianism becomes appealing. As people who are only nice when their circumstances are nice are more likely mirrors of their conditions than they are meaningfully kind, people who only reflect their common lives lack full personhood. Common life must be participated in by conscious choice for the right balance to be struck, and that requires the philosophical journey through the self-mortifying fires of total doubt from common life back to common life. The temptation of the philosopher is to leave common life and remain away, to then look back with contempt and disdain on common life, which admittedly can feel justified considering the oppression givens can cause. This temptation must be resisted, and instead those on the philosophical journey must deny the possibility of autonomous reasoning and instead cultivate an attitude of piety and affirmation toward the domain of custom taken as a whole. Total doubt, then, is presented as a moment in the dialectical drama of philosophical self-knowledge designed to undermine a false view of philosophical autonomy and to restore the thinker to the autonomy of custom. But why is this? Why exactly is autonomous reasoning destined for self-effacement? Yes, it is claimed that when rationality cannot be infected with the prejudice of custom, the claims of rationality cannot be satisfied anywhere in the world of custom. But why? To start, and to allude again to The Truism of the Rational by O.G. Rose, rationality is itself thanks to a truth. But since rationality comes after ascension to a truth, rationality cannot be rational all the way down. Something else, imagination, emotions, traditions, must be used for truth selection. If rationality is to be itself, it cannot be autonomously rational. And if it thinks it is, rationality is self-deceived. What we may perhaps describe as the chief aim of Hume's philosophy was to prove that belief rested neither on reason nor on evidence. And a reason for this is because even belief grounded on rationality is ultimately grounded on a truth selected by non-rational means. The same can be said about evidence, because what constitutes evidence is relative to whatever case we are trying to prove, and cases are only matters of rationality after a truth is selected. We cannot by means of reason explain any of the ultimate characteristics of our experience, Hume stressed. Consequently, an autonomous rationality cannot unveil to us the depths of the world, only motivate us to shape the world into the image of the depths we think should be hidden within. To find these depths and a new principle that could hold us together, autonomous and unbound rationality will compel us to turn the world inside out. Secondly, if rationality paradoxically refuses to accept any influence from anything that isn't rational, then rationality cannot be based on a truth that would make rationality actually possible. And thus there is nowhere in the world in which it can apply only over it. If we were to try to spread wealth, for example, based on a rational principle, how would we rationally define the wealthy from the poor? Having 100,000 in Bedford, Virginia would make us relatively well off, but 100,000 in California would be much less significant. It is only in a common life that we can determine the rich and the poor in a given area and also where wealth needs to be sent. If we were instead to set a general rule in the name of justice, such as everyone who makes 100,000 is rich and should pay 60% taxes to those making 35,000 a year, then there would be dire and ironically unjust consequences in which the poor in California are taxed for those who, relative to Virginia, are middle class. Hence, divided from common life, a principle which seems to itself a rational method for increasing justice ends up increasing injustice. Its goal cannot be realized in the world only on spreadsheets according to general metrics. Thirdly, when the problem of internally consistent systems by O.G. Rose in mind, of internally consistent systems by O.G. Rose in mind, the world and experience often function as tiebreakers between internally consistent theories, rationalities, and predictions. According to theory X, belief in God will make us miserable, and the theory entails 4 pieces of convincing evidence. According to theory Y, though, belief in God will make us happy, and the theory entails 4 pieces of convincing evidence. So which theory is right? The only way to find out is to live out each theory and risk being wrong. But even if we did this, the result we found might only apply to us in the extremely particular way we lived out that theory. If our life suggested Y was true, the conclusion might only follow that Y is true for us. Hence, a situation arises in which experience is needed to break a theoretical tie. But even if the tie is broken, the results might be bound up with us. Thus, X might be true for one common life and Y for another. No autonomous principle of reason can be established rationally over all common lives. If it is true that God is good, it is rational to live as if belief in God will make you happy. If it is true that God is evil, on the other hand, it is irrational to live as if God is good. Yet, if we live as if God is good, considering the endless psychological tactics the brain uses on itself to confirm itself, rightly or wrongly, we will likely create evidence for ourselves that is indeed true and rational that God is good. Living out a theory to confirm it is not necessarily a reliable way to confirm it, though it might be better than nothing. That said, Karl Popper in mind, if countless people over centuries lived out theory X, there would be stronger reason to believe theory X is like the truth. For though one individual can be self-deceived, there's much better reason to believe millions over various tests, stresses, and challenges life can bring are not self-deceived, even if we're ultimately wrong. Thus, the importance of common life in tradition. Right or wrong, they are extensive processes of falsification through time that can attain some level, some degree of reliability or of probability. Not certainly, but not even science can obtain certainty. The best we can hope for are probable inferences. And if we follow Hume, of all the ways we could decide to run society, those theories based on common life and tradition are those most likely to be useful. Fourth and lastly, on why rationality cannot be autonomous and useful is the issue of probability. Little overall in life can be reduced to linear models or mathematical laws. If there was an equation for what would make my wife happy, then autonomous rationality would be useful in regard to love. But instead, humans don't always know what they want, and often they want multiple things at the same time that cancel one another out, self-deceive themselves, and hide their preferences. And all this humans can do without realizing they're even doing it. And that's not even to touch on the countless cognitive fallacies that further confuse the issue, confirmation bias, backfire effect, and so on. When dealing with people, we are often guessing at what we should and shouldn't do. And even when we guess well, we can end up with severe consequences. Also, on the macro level, when it comes to, say, economic policy, we cannot rationally verify that reducing interest rates will stimulate the economy, for example. At best, we might be able to establish reason to believe that low interest rates will expand the stock market, but reason alone will not be enough to move us beyond probability to certainty. And if we aren't dealing with certainty, we are dealing with unknowns, say how one community will respond to easy credit, low mortgage rates, and so forth, unknowns of which would be incredibly difficult to guess correctly about if a person didn't live in the impacted communities, a famous point from Hayek. Yes, rationality can aid us in determining the meaning of what we encounter in a given common life, but rationality cannot fill in the void left by a lack of experience in a given common life, though of course it will try.
Section 4. For Hume, the alternative to autonomous rationality is not skepticism, but reliance on tests which are empirically applicable. But unfortunately, few overall phenomena in the world can be tested through the scientific method, though the modern world seems to think nearly everything can be. For social policy, morals, and so on, we need a process like the scientific method, and for Hume, the closest we can get to that is tradition, givens tested through time, and common life. Yes, givens can be wrong, illusionary, and forces of oppression, and if convincing arguments would have us reform them, we should. That said, we should be slow before tearing down Chesterton's fence, per se. Karl Popper offered a beautiful image for how to think about scientific truth that could also describe tradition-based truth. Science does not rest upon a solid bedrock. The bold structure of its theories rises, as it were, above a swamp. It is like a building erected on piles. The piles are driven down from above into the swamp, but not down to any natural or given base. And if we stop driving the pillars deeper, it is not because we have reached firm ground. We simply stop when we are satisfied that the piles are firm enough to carry the structure, at least for the time being. So it goes with common life, our worldviews, and our philosophies. We may believe our lifestyles are erected upon the solid bedrock of autonomous rationality, and though they naturally feel that way, they are not. This hints at why the doctrine of natural belief is one of the most essential and perhaps the most characteristic doctrine in Hume's philosophy. Keeping in mind that by natural belief, Hume meant a belief that we have come naturally to, that has come naturally to us from the lives we live, impressions we experience, and so on, ergo, common life beliefs. This in mind, we can start to understand what Hume was trying to accomplish through his famous arguments against causality. Similar to how Popper criticized the commonly held notion that science was a process of verification for the sake of strengthening it with an epistemology of falsification, Hume wanted to criticize the common view of the function of reason for the sake of making rationality truer, because autonomous rationality was a self-canceling falsehood. Belief in causal action is, Hume argued, equally natural and indispensable. He did not think causality was irrational, but that it was not arrived at through induction or rationality alone. Rather, causality was arrived at naturally. It was a necessary belief that, though unjustifiable in terms of autonomous rationality, did not need rational justification, and if people thought it did, they would lose their minds for no good reason. Norman Kemp Smith writes, Hume's maxim that reason was and ought to be the slave of the natural beliefs and of the passions is not therefore, as he treats it, unethical. In his intention, it is directed against what he conceived to be a mistaken ethics and a false understanding of how man's life is and ought to be lived. Moral judgments and marking out the good and the evil have their source not in the eternal nature of any independent reality, but solely in the particular fabric and constitution of the human species. We know how we should live from how we live. Hume hoped to show that what we thought was rationally justifiable was instead naturally justifiable. Reason requiring truth to be itself can lay no claim to legislative power. Until experience has spoken, no assertion as to the possibilities of causal connection can be made. Likewise, no claim can be made about what phenomenon fall under the categories of good and evil, identity and non-identity, and many of the other topics Hume discussed in a treatise of human nature. Similarly, the belief in the existence of a body is a natural belief due to the ultimate instincts or orientations which constitute our human nature. All of these beliefs on morality, identity, reality, and so forth are ultimately natural beliefs, not rational beliefs. And though, rationality can help purify them for the better when autonomous rationality is deemed impossible, rationality alone can ultimately ground them, cannot ultimately ground them. Belief operates by way of the imagination, not of reason, and since it is the imagination that is appealed to, it is in what is common to the vulgar and to the philosophical systems that the ultimately decisive influence is to be looked for. In Realism and the Aim of Science, Karl Popper pointed out, Hume's argument does not establish that we may not draw any inference from observation to theory. It merely establishes that we may not draw verifying inferences from observations to theories, leaving open the possibility that we may draw falsifying inferences. Karl Popper was exactly right, which is why Hume warned we must revere common life. As humans, we are going to draw inferences, and if we are not aware that rationally autonomous inferences seem possible but are not, we are likely to believe we draw verifying inferences, and worse yet, feel certain and verified relative to false inferences. We practically induct in a lived space between truth and rationality, but we cannot induct with rationality within rationality, nor can we induct truth within truth. Practically inducting is possible and inevitable, but inducting is impossible and tempting. As Popper wanted to remove grandeur from sciences precisely for the sake of saving science, Hume wanted to remove grandeur from rationality before it self-negated itself. Hume criticized rationality to save it. It seems Hume worried rationality would become what humanity assumed was an objective force for good. That's what it seems like Hume was concerned by, and thus an unstoppable force of pseudo-divine destruction, especially considering his humanity's worrisome conviction that reason could never be in conflict with itself, and thus reason was incapable of checking and balancing reason. Consider the problem of internally consistent systems, as discussed by O.G. Rose elsewhere. But Hume was misread, and total war became the form of war in the 20th century. World War I resulted in 8 million dead, more dead than all the wars fought in Europe during the 2-century period of civilized warfare beforehand. Livingston laid out the horror well in his book, as did Adorno and Horkheimer in The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Have we turned out well?
Section 5. Critical reasons do not justify a theory, for the fact that one theory has so far withstood criticism better than another is no reason whatsoever for supposing that it is actually true, Karl Popper warned. Hence, autonomous rationality is impossible. As Hume taught that even after 1 million observations of a ball falling, we cannot confirm a natural law of gravity, so it is the case that even after 1 million pieces of evidence, we cannot justify an absolute truth. Rational justification, for partially this reason, is not the great teacher of mankind, as Hume thought, but custom and tradition, according to Popper. We always discover regularities by the essentially different method of trial and error, of conjecture and refutation, or of learning from our mistakes. Absolute exactness does not exist, not even in logic and mathematics. And for Hume, custom and tradition are processes entailing exactly these practices. The allegation that we do in fact proceed by induction is a sheer myth, and the alleged evidence in favor of this alleged fact is partly not existent, and partly obtained by misinterpreting the facts. All learning is learning from experience. Man is a believing animal because he is an acting animal. When humans experience X following from Y 10 times, though a natural law cannot be established, according to autonomous rationality, a natural belief that Y causes X can, and even must, be established. No, repetition through experience and action cannot make induction possible or achieve objective truth, but they can provide natural reason, where autonomous reason is delusional. Additionally, it is with an experience in common life that Hume's true philosopher can emerge, realizing that repetition is a foundation for thought more than autonomous rationality, and thus come to see that the heroic moment of philosophical reflection is a joke at humanity's own expense. Hume's reflections on common life being the main organizing principle of human life could perhaps find support from within the work of Carl Jung, if it is indeed the case that societies before the Enlightenment operated more so by observation and experience, searching for repetitive patterns that were then codified into law. An attempt for justifying them objectively was not thought necessary until the Enlightenment, perhaps due to the assumption of God's existence. This would indeed suggest that Hume was right. Jung was concerned with finding archetypes in stories and repeating patterns of social organization, and though Jung believed this suggested the existence of what could be called mental organs, from a sociological and behavioral standpoint, it would also suggest that many societies over long enough periods of time ended up observing the same patterns across similar situations, patterns that societies then tried to preserve in stories. These patterns or archetypes were not so much rational but natural beliefs, and the fact that they were observed working by countless people over countless decades was thought to be reason enough to assume the patterns were mostly right, even if it was impossible to confirm them objectively. Once the Enlightenment started and God abandoned, and keep in mind that God previously had the function of providing authority to observe patterns in place of rational justification, it was then felt that observing patterns wasn't enough justification, thus starting the quest for autonomous rationality. Of course, observations don't seem to be enough the moment we think about them, and thus translate them into rational terms, they automatically fail to meet, as discussed in On Thinking and Perceiving by O.G. Rose. Jung, Hume, and evolution in general all seem to suggest that humans operate according to perception more than rationality, that perception or experience is a source of natural beliefs, which are much more consequential for humans than rational beliefs. Societies are primarily founded on perception, but after the Enlightenment, rightly or wrongly, humanity came to believe society needed a solely rational justification, especially in light of God's death. But this required an autonomous rationality that Hume saw was impossible, and we're still attempting the impossible to this day, trying to make ourselves worthy of the murder to which Nietzsche feared we'd never live up to. This was section 2 of part 2 of The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.